We're awaiting the arrival of Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull at the White House. He's set to meet with President Trump in the Oval Office before the two leaders hold a joint news conference in a couple of hours. We expect President Trump to face questions for the first time in what will be the first formal news conference since the Florida school shooting. We will bring you that as it happens live. Fox News alert. President Trump ramping up his calls to arm some of our nation's teachers. He was talking school safety at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, in the last hour, as you probably saw on Fox News, saying gun-free zones around our nation's schools only put students in danger. This is Outnumbered. I'm Harris Faulkner. Here today, Sandra Smith. Anchor of the Intelligence Report, Trish Regan. Got to wait for the cameras
there
to catch. There she is. And now, anchor of the Intelligence Report, Trish Regan. She gets a double.
There she is.
Yeah, there she is. Former deputy spokesperson for the State Department and Fox News analyst Marie Harf. And back with us on Outnumbered, GoPac Chairman David Avella is here. And, well, we say he's outnumbered, but he's right at home.
I am right at home and leaving here and going to my 4-year-old's birthday party.
Great.
She turns 4, and her sister turned 2 a couple weeks ago.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
You got
the
little
Avella
ones.
household's all about the party.
A lot of cake. Thankfully, Nancy Pelosi's crumbs are getting to the event.
Ooh, and it starts early. Let's get to the news. Good to have you. President Trump ramping up his calls for school safety at the Conservative Political Action Conference today. He urged school officials to do what they can to protect children. One of his proposals, arming some teachers who know how to use a gun.
When we declare our schools to be gun-free zones, it just puts our students in far more danger. Well-trained, gun-adept teachers and coaches and people that work in those buildings, people that were in the Marines for 20 years and retired, people in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, people that are adept with weaponry and with guns. They teach. You do a concealed carry permit.
He also talked about his plan to strengthen background checks.
And there's nobody that loves the Second Amendment more than I do, and there's nobody that respects the NRA. They're friends of mine. They backed us all. They're great people. They're patriots. But they're great people. But we really do have to strengthen up, really strengthen up background checks. We have to do that. And we have to do, for the mentally ill, we have to do we don't want people that are mentally ill to be having any form of weaponry. We have to be very strong on that. So we're going to do that, and I really believe that Congress is going to get it through this time, and they have a different leader. They have somebody that wants to get it through, not somebody that just all talk, no action, like so many of these folks. This is somebody that wants to get it through. But I also want to protect. We need a hardened site. It has to be hardened. It can't be soft, because they'll sneak in through a window.
All righty. So the president, they're putting this out. Some teachers are pushing back on it, but what he's saying is that those who have the propensity and the training, the openness to learn to use a weapon, he wants to see that. What are your thoughts?
It's great to put ideas out there and to have a discussion that is more than what the typical debate is, which moves no Americans, which Marie's side will immediately say, let's ban guns. Republicans will say, there's no need to ban guns because the way we are secure is by being able to protect ourselves. And the president says, let's talk about some other ideas. Let's have a discussion. Here is one part of the discussion that's not happening. And as an organization that focuses on state-level governments and what's happening is what's happening at the state level.
Right.
Because you have very dramatically different directions going. You've got the governor of this state here of New York wants to put 4 governors together and go one way. You've got many Midwestern state governors and their state legislatures are going a different way and giving Americans more of an opportunity to protect themselves through the Second Amendment. So while we have a big national discussion going on, there is equally important what's happening at the state level. Otherwise, we have this patchwork of what's happening across the country.
You know, Trish, what's interesting, and I'm so glad that you kind of pointed out the difference there between what the president is calling for and what others are quoting him as calling for. He's not saying put guns in the hands of every teacher. But those who would be open to the training and also bump maybe a little bonus in their way too. Your thoughts?
Look, I feel for teachers right now. I think schools are obviously a pretty scary place to be. If you are someone that is trained in a firearm, really trained, you should be able to protect yourself and the kids. That said, Harris, my concern in all of this is this now going to become a job requirement for a teacher? And I know people say, oh, it's not going to go that far, but does the school board or this principal say, oh, Harris, by the way, you know how to shoot a shotgun or a fire. You've had firearm training, so you're going to get the job instead of Sandra. I want to make sure that our teachers are teaching. Yeah. And, you know, if leave the security to the people that are good at security.
All right, let's stop right there. The sheriff's deputy, who we now know, and it was interesting at that town hall on CNN that Sheriff Israel didn't volunteer this information. I don't know when he learned it, but I have to think they looked at the tapes outside that school before 2 nights ago. I don't know. Seems common sense to me. But a sheriff's deputy, armed, ready, stood out for 4 minutes. They've got the videotape. He didn't go in. So sometimes you can have the training, and then what happens?
Right. So, look, I mean, if we have to do what Israel does, so be it. These are our children. These
Not
kids are our
Israel,
future.
but the nation.
Yes, the nation of Israel. We need to take this seriously. And I don't care if you put it, you know, we have U.S. Marshals on flights.
Exactly.
So we need U.S. Marshals in classrooms. No parent should ever have to deal with what those parents are dealing with. And the parent, the father that got up there and said, look, there never should have been another school shooting after Columbine, was right. He was absolutely right. And I don't know what it's going to take. It's probably going to take a lot of money. But that's just money. And we can't risk those lives.
Well, you have a president who also is the law and order president who says we need to enforce and practice the laws that are currently on the books. And that's not happening in our states and cities. I mean, look at Chicago. I mean, where's the mention of what's happening in that city right now? It is a disaster. You talk to anybody who lives there, and even in the safest neighborhoods, and it's frightening. So there's a bigger conversation to be had here, but it is amazing to watch this president in a 90-minute speech to a conservative audience and getting cheers when talking about changing gun control laws in this country. This is obviously a turning point, David.
Sandra, you heard me last week when I joined you and Bill and talked about how the Secretary of Education needs to become the Secretary of Education Security. And the president needs to direct Betsy DeVos to find every outdated, outmoded, ineffective education program, get rid of it, and put it into school security. And make sure that when we talk about having individuals in to protect, I want to make sure guns aren't getting in. Because today it was an assault rifle. But is it any worse next year if someone comes in with a revolver and shoots six children? No, it's
or an
not.
explosive device. I mean, we're talking about guns, but what about those other things that they're not regulated because they don't exist until somebody makes it?
Schools are some of the least secure buildings we have in this country.
But we're also just focusing a lot on schools here, and I understand why. But this last year, we've had a church shooting, the concert shooting in Las Vegas. We've talked a lot about how, because of our freedoms in America, there are a lot of soft targets, whether it's malls, whether it's concerts. We've seen, so yes, the conversation should be about school safety,
but they do have armed guards
than
at most malls.
Well, okay, but at concerts or churches,
They're
right?
there too.
It is a bigger question than just securing our schools. It's a larger question about mental health, about gun regulation. Having governors now being willing to say, let's up the age to 21, that's one thing that's happening at some state levels.
All right, but
It's
I don't
hard to
think
know.
that would have changed the situation at the church shooting.
No one policy will have been able to prevent every single tragedy
Absolutely,
that's happened, and that can't be the standard for policy making.
So-
but if it can make it harder for one crazy person to get a gun,
If they're under the age of 21.
so
if they
we should
happen to
look,
fit
but
that
we should
category.
also look
But
at.
the other items
I
that you
happen to
mentioned
think we
didn't
should
fit
look
that
at
category.
high-capacity magazines.
The reason
for
I say
example.
this is not just to push back, just to be prickly about it. I say it, prickly pear. That's my nickname at home. I say it because if we let things get so big, we don't do anything. And
Right.
that's kind of what we're known for in our politics. We just get so big, we try to cram in so much that the one thing that we could do, we don't get done. The teachers union is pressing against arming teachers. Let's look at their quote if we can pop that up on the screen. We don't want to be and would, can we scroll forward? I don't think they're paying attention. All right. We don't want to be and would never have the expertise needed to be sharpshooters. No amount of training can prepare an armed teacher to go up against an AR-15. David?
It's hard to know exactly where the outcome of this happens as far as the gun debate, here is one thing that I feel reasonably confident of. There will be Republicans who lose elections this year because of this year, and there will be Democrats who lose elections this year because of this year. If you think that Joe Manchin or John Tester or Joe Donnelly can come out against the Second Amendment and support many of the things that Chuck Schumer is going to want them to support, they will lose their seats in the U.S. Senate. Just as there will be some Republicans in suburban districts who could lose their seats because of this issue. It's a very...
Let me push you on that a little bit.
Sure.
Justice Scalia wrote, the Second Amendment is not unlimited. You, Republicans, and you just did it, like to say any gun restrictions that Democrats want to put forward is, quote, against the Second Amendment. That is not the case. You can be a supporter of the Second Amendment and also say maybe we shouldn't have high magazine clips. For example, appeals courts in this country have routinely upheld state-level assault weapons bans. So it's not fair in the conversation to say Democrats who want gun regulation are against the Second Amendment. That is not fair, and it's disingenuous.
Well,
Marie, GoPac will pay for you to travel to any state and advise a Democratic senator in West Virginia, Montana, Indiana to advise a Democratic senator to be against the Second Amendment.
But they're not against. This is my point. You just made my point. Being for common sense gun reform is not anti-Second Amendment. And by the way, there are other rights in addition to that. The right not to get shot in church or school. That also is up there with the right to bear arms.
So the Democratic Party's nominee in the last election was for the Australian rule of confiscation. Now, either the Democratic Party,
certain kinds of weapons.
Either the Democratic Party has moved away from Hillary Clinton, or they still believe that. And it's a complete rebuke of Hillary Clinton from just a year ago.
I think they are trying to move away from Hillary Clinton, according to what Marie just said.
Well, it's a big
Sandra?
conversation that's being had on this couch and across the country right now, and you just saw it there at CPAC.
Yep.
Question is what sort of action will actually take place while this debate is still so hot?
Great question. We don't know that today.
All right. We will come back to this topic a little bit later in the hour. The president spent some time on it today. Also at CPAC, President Trump used some of his strongest language yet on immigration and his border wall, the warning he's sending to Democrats. And the president announced what he calls the largest ever set of sanctions on North Korea, what the new sanctions aim to do, and whether they can succeed where others have failed. We'll talk about it. Stay close.
Fox News alert Governor Rick Scott announcing a major plan to keep Florida students safe in the aftermath of the massacre last week in Parkland, saying he wants to make it impossible for someone with a mental illness to purchase a gun. And he said this.
We will require all individuals purchasing firearms to be 21 or older. Let me repeat. We will require all individuals purchasing firearms to be 21 or older.
Governor Scott says he is also calling for providing millions to keep students safe, including putting mandatory law enforcement officers in every public school. And now, for the first time, we're hearing Nicholas Cruz, in his own words, talk about his emotions 3 months before 17 people were killed. He called Palm Beach County dispatchers back in November after getting into a fight with the people he was staying with following his mother's death. Listen.
I kind of got mad and I started punching walls and stuff, and then a kid came at me and threw me on the ground. And he started attacking me and he kicked me out of the house and he said he was going to gut me. Thing is, I lost my mother a couple of weeks ago, so like I'm dealing with a bunch of things right now.
All this as a school resource officer, Deputy Scott Peterson, has now resigned after video showed him taking cover during that shooting and never going inside. Phil Keating is live from Parkland. Phil?
Yeah, the whole strategy from school districts to police and sheriff's department after Columbine High School's massacre 19 years ago replaced in its severity and death toll by what happened here just 9 days ago, Stoneman Douglas, with 17 people killed by the alleged attacker, Nicholas Cruz. Well, the strategy now is if guns start firing bullets inside of a school, all officers responding immediately storm the hallways and classrooms and engage the suspects. And according to the sheriff, he actually has school surveillance videotape from the cameras mounted around the building, supporting what he said yesterday, that this school resource officer basically got to a doorway, heard the bullets, and didn't go in. It was just 9 days ago, as I mentioned, those helicopter aerials showing students and teachers fleeing from this high school as terror and panic, and 150 bullets unloaded in about 3 minutes inside the school. And now Scott Peterson, who was on the force for about 30-plus years, and just 4 years ago was awarded School Resource Officer of the Year. First, he was suspended by the sheriff yesterday afternoon, and then Peterson just resigned and retired, as he can do. The sheriff told everybody how sickened he was at the inaction.
What I saw was a deputy arrive at the west side of Building 12, take up a position, and he never went in.
So what should he have done?
Went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer.
And on his way to Marine One this morning in Washington, President Trump once again touched on what happened here in Parkland, and specifically about the inaction and failure by the school resource officer to go in, even though he was holding his own weapon packed full of ammunition, but did nothing. Take a listen to the president.
When it came time to get in there and do something, he didn't have the courage, or something happened. But he certainly did a poor job. There's no question about that. He was there for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes. That was during the entire shooting. He heard it right at the beginning. So he certainly did a poor job. But that's a case where somebody was outside, they're trained, they didn't react properly under pressure, or they were a coward. It was a real shot to the police department.
And this morning, the very first teachers returned to their classrooms 9 days after this horrible massacre. Teachers were voluntarily allowed back into the school today to retrieve any personal items they may have left behind as they fled their classrooms and buildings in terror on Valentine's Day. Things like purses, cell phones, briefcases. On Monday and Tuesday, teachers will be here for an official planning day. Then on Wednesday, the 3,000 plus high school students who remain not at school, not studying, but trying to recover from what has happened. They will return next Wednesday, and there is an informal open house Sunday afternoon for all of the students and their parents to come here to the school and basically learn about the new amended schedule. It's going to be a half day for some students, but there will be plenty of security, armed security on the scene, as well as many counselors, support staff to deal with what will be undoubtedly a flood of emotions this Sunday and into next week.
Phil Keating in Parkland, Florida for us. Thank you. Well, Fox News alert for you. Tightening the noose on North Korea. President Trump at CPAC announcing what may be the toughest sanctions yet on the rogue regime, ratcheting up the pressure on the North to give up its nuclear weapons programs. Watch.
North Korea, we imposed today the heaviest sanctions ever imposed on a country before. And frankly, hopefully something positive can happen. We will see. But hopefully something positive can happen. But that just was announced, and I want to let you know we have imposed the heaviest sanctions ever imposed.
As we get more details on these sanctions, they are expected to be aimed at more than 50 ships and shipping companies used to fund the North's nuclear program and its military. Certainly, David, the president talking tough there on North Korea. What do you think?
If our joint activities with South Korea doesn't have the North Korean leader all worked up, saying he's going to get his missiles going again, then certainly these sanctions will. But we're only left with a few options here if we want to make sure North Korea doesn't get fully capable of being able to send a rocket over here with a nuclear weapon and take out one of our cities. We are in very serious times here.
Trish, what did you think as you heard the president there?
I think there's a lot more we can be doing and a lot more we should be doing. I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to go after China because China has a ton of intelligence on North Korea. China would have the ability to affect change in North Korea, and yet the Chinese promised to sign on to sanctions, and yet they're still trading with the North Koreans, as are the Russians, by the way. So we need to get serious about how we are approaching China. We have obviously a very big economic relationship with them. We don't need to have one, right? I mean, that will hurt them more than it will hurt us. And maybe then they'll start to get a clue and they'll understand how seriously we think the North Korea situation is.
Yeah. You know, I'm starting to suspect that China just doesn't want to share that category of hegemon in the region. You know, why won't they do more? It is very much time, Trish, I agree with you, to put some pressure on them and to start to ask
they want
questions
the buffer.
that
they're
make
also
them
scared
firm.
of conflict on their border, basically. I mean, I think they're scared that if they do things that destabilize the North Korean regime and there are refugees flowing out, I mean, this is something that's very much in their neighborhood. I think they absolutely could and should do more, but this affects them much more directly than it affects us.
But to the president's credit, why our now energy policy to make us independent and be able to sell to countries all over the world and be less dependent on Russian coal and be less dependent on Chinese coal. I mean, we want to talk about putting pressure on Russia and China. We have to cause them a little bit of economic pain to get them to want to participate.
We could do that pretty fast. We could do that pretty fast, I'm telling you. Look, they are in complete violation of many, many different laws we have.
Right.
And when it comes to intellectual property, we're losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year in intellectual property. They are stealing it from us. So we could very easily say, all right, all those companies, and you know what? Companies in America aren't going to like it because they want that market over there. But we can say, you know what, we're not going to do trade.
Marie, you haven't gotten in here, and you are the former spokesperson for the State Department. You are privy to a lot of information on all of this. Where do you stand?
There was well, first, I think that sanctions are a good thing, and we should keep ratcheting them up, and we should see if that will pressure countries like China and Russia, certainly. There was an interesting tidbit out of Vice President Pence's trip last week to South Korea. The State Department said this week that he had a meeting scheduled with a North Korean diplomat, representative, and at the last minute, the North Koreans canceled. And I'm still trying to read the tea leaves on that one to see maybe why they pulled back from that. But he showed a willingness to talk to the North Koreans, which I think was a good sign. Sanctions have to be paired with a diplomatic option that is not appeasement, but is opening the door to avoiding a military conflict, which would have horrible consequences in terms of human life. So I want to see these sanctions in a broader strategy of how this moves forward and where we go from here. I think maybe Secretary Mnuchin talked about that a little bit today. I'll take a look later. So what you're pointing to is
the timing of these sanctions on the heels of that meeting being canceled between North Korean officials and Vice President Pence.
Right.
And we know that he was kind of in the constellation with Kim Jong-un's sister.
Right.
So, yeah, the timing is interesting.
Well, don't go anywhere after Outnumbered, because coming up on Outnumbered Overtime, Harris will speak to former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. He's been at CPAC for the last 2 days. We'll get his reaction to the new sanctions against North Korea, so stay tuned for that. All right, we are awaiting the arrival of Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull at the White House. He and President Trump will hold a joint news conference this afternoon. We expect the president to face more questions on school safety and guns in the wake of the Florida shooting. We will bring you that live when it happens. Stay tuned.
The news this hour, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is set to arrive at the White House at any moment. He will meet with President Trump in the Oval Office before they hold a joint news conference later this afternoon. We expect the president to face more questions on the Florida high school shooting. This will be the president's first formal news conference since the tragedy. Yesterday, he outlined some of his top priorities on gun control and the matter. Watch.
We're going to do strong background checks. We're going to work on getting the age up to 21 instead of 18. We're getting rid of the bump stocks. And we're going to be focusing very strongly on mental health.
The NRA reportedly is saying they do not support raising the minimum age to buy a weapon, any weapon. However, they are open to strengthening background checks and regulating not banning bump stocks. You know, David, as we talk more in detail about the gun control issue, you and I were talking off camera about, well, how does that actually fit into the picture of what we can get done before they go back to school on Tuesday?
Well, we need to continue looking at how do we best make our schools more secure, How do we make sure the guns don't even get in there in the first place? And we talked about it earlier today. It is much harder to get into this building than it is to get into a school right now, or many other places that we go into society. That has to be looked at. Also, and Kimberly Strassel wrote about it this morning in the Wall Street Journal, a recent Washington Post ABC News poll that said 8 in 10 Americans think that we have to look at mental health laws because that could have helped prevent some of this. 8 in 10 Americans, 80% of Americans, that's a far higher number than any other proposal we have out there right now going on. That needs to be looked at. It's a big discussion.
Trish, what do you think is doable with the NRA based on what we know that they have said since this and after other incidents like Las Vegas?
I think a lot is doable. And the reason I say that is because I don't think there is one, and you saw the reaction of the crowd to the president's speech there. And there are many card-carrying NRA members there at CPAC. But there's an opportunity here, and it's going to take some real leadership. And we have seen, I commend the president for this, real leadership coming from the White House right now in terms of getting some ideas out there on the table. And if we can have a real dialogue about this that's not clouded with all the partisan nonsense as this issue typically is, then we will get somewhere. And I think he will bring his base along. You heard him talk about the NRA and say they're great people, they're patriots, and I think they'll do the right thing. Well, I think they will too.
Yeah, he says it's not the president against the NRA. He said that yesterday. He said that during that roundtable discussion with law enforcement. You know, Sandra, one of the big questions, because you and I have talked about the ban that already exists, not ban, but the age restriction that already exists when it comes to handguns. This would be long guns. And 18-year-olds, there are people who can join our military. So how do you kind of get in there and put restrictions in, or is that a zone that shouldn't be touched?
It's a tough conversation, as everybody has agreed, right? We're having it. That's the important part. But the question is, will everybody be satisfied if changes like that take place? The fear is Democrats are asking for a lot, right, as they do in the wake of these shootings when it comes to banning certain guns or banning things that can change the way guns work. Right. It's the conservatives like that are in that CPAC crowd today that they worry about that slippery slope.
Right. And I think yesterday I was frustrated by Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, speaking at CPAC because he did not come with a message of compromise. You're right, President Trump has. President Trump is actually further out ahead of CPAC in terms of gun reforms. Wayne LaPierre came with an incredibly partisan, nasty, dark message about Democrats, first of all, and about the gun issue. I don't understand why the NRA can't just come out.
First of all, he was responding to a very nasty message that was coming from the left. That was the NRA has blood on their hands in school shootings.
Sure.
Like this.
Blaming the NRA.
Well, I blame the NRA for advocating for laxer gun laws. They would admit that, right? I think that what I just said is a statement of fact. The question is, why can't the NRA get behind getting rid of bump stocks? Like, why are they unwilling at least?
That's not even true. They're not behind that.
What we just said in the read that they were interested in regulating them, not banning them. Like, why can't they appear to move at all, and why are they making it so partisan? Because they are. I mean, Wayne LaPierre, that was a partisan speech yesterday by Wayne LaPierre.
There's been a lot of reaction
from
people to the NRA president's speech, and some saw it as an opportunity that it was kind of confirming that the president had been talking to the NRA and sort of talking to the NRA's base, which is something you do right before change sometimes.
The NRA is made up of members of Americans that are Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
To sit here and to suggest that somehow there's this monolithic organization that's run by only people that sit in Washington, D.C. and make decisions and spend money in races, though there are many organizations that spend far more money than the NRA in an election. We don't talk about them and what they're trying to do, Planned Parenthood and
the teachers union. Of the NRA,
he waited
public
patiently.
Face of the NRA
Go ahead, David, finish.
Was very partisan yesterday. Do you admit that?
He laid out his vision on where this needs to go. The president, to his credit, bringing it back to what we said in the first segment, to his credit, is trying to put ideas on the table so that we can have this discussion. Is it going to get solved in the next couple of days? Probably not, but it's why the 2018 elections are so important, because it's the makeup of the next Congress where you probably are going to see some action.
Well, just from covering it, David, you and I have been talking. Have we ever seen this much, though, from the NRA after one of these incidents? I mean, they are fully engaged in the conversation, and isn't that where we say we want to be?
NRA members have always been engaged, and they turn out, they contact members of Congress, they turn out state legislators far more than the other side does. That's why they're effective, because their members get up and talk about what they believe.
All right. President Trump is accusing Democrats of standing in the way as he pushed for immigration reform at CPAC. One day after the president threatened to pull ICE agents from California if the state continues to refuse to assist federal authorities. They want the whole state, to be sanctuary there. So what would the effect of that be? And does an immigration deal look even more likely or unlikely? We'll talk about it.
Fox News alert, we are now learning that Trump campaign aide Rick Gates will be appearing at a plea hearing this afternoon in the 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time hour. He faces one count of conspiracy against the United States, and the second count that he faces is a false statement to special counsel Robert Mueller's office and FBI agents. This is just the latest in the Robert Mueller investigation as it goes forward. Obviously, too, one could connect the dots that he's cooperating still with the Mueller investigation. Paul Manafort has come out with a statement as well. 32 counts in total against these two individuals. Paul Manafort came out earlier.
Additional.
Correct. They came out earlier with a statement saying he is innocent of all the allegations against him. Rick Gates, though, we'll see what happens. A plea hearing, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Your thoughts?
None of it's connected to Russia or the Trump campaign and the collusion that the Democrats accused of and got this whole investigation started. Rick Gates and Paul Manafort have ultimately been indicted about business practices they did that had no connection to the 2016 elections, the Trump campaign, or anything that this Mueller investigation started out investigating.
And Corey Lewandowski, I spoke to earlier today, obviously having worked with the campaign as well. Rick Gates, it was an integral part of Donald Trump's campaign. Corey Lewandowski was quick to point out this is still, there's no tying together of collusion of the Trump campaign with Russia. This is separate.
So first of all, the conspiracy that he has now reportedly pled guilty to, that will be interesting to see the details on that.
We don't know what that is
We don't know what that is yet. It'll be interesting. That was what I was saying. The second point, though, is some of the business dealings that have